Firstly, can I thank New Zealand Health Group for hosting this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge the work that you and your team have done during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Geneva healthcare workers are on the front line at MIQ facilities. Your support workers from across the group were essential services under lockdown and are still essential to our communities. I also want to acknowledge the group's commitment to providing good terms and conditions for its workers. You are known to have a constructive relationship with your unions and working together for the benefit of your frontline workforce. And it's good to have you here with Mel Ansell-Bridges from the Council of Trade Unions. And as you'll see in this announcement, we're trying to find ways through fair pay agreements for unions, workers and employers to work together for the good of our country. I believe that after the year of COVID, we all want to see our essential workers, like care workers, be recognised with decent pay and conditions across the board. Indeed, over the year of COVID, New Zealanders have been reminded of the critical work done by many people who have been undervalued in their work for too long. People like the cleaners, the bus drivers, the security guards, the supermarket checkout workers. For decades, these workers haven't had a fair go. Their work has been undervalued and driven down by competitive tendering processes. Fair pay agreements are about putting an end to that and making sure that those workers do receive a fair go. So today, I'm very proud to announce that the government is delivering on its election commitment to implement fair pay agreements, which will improve wages and conditions, as well as help to support our economic recovery. Investing in our people is at the heart of our government's COVID-19 recovery plan. Fair pay agreements will improve terms and conditions and wages for employees. They will encourage businesses to invest in training, as well as level the playing field so that good employers don't get undercut and disadvantaged by those who would take advantage. We expect that this will help out those essential workers who have served our country so well through the pandemic by giving them better protections and opportunities in their work. I've already heard calls for workers like supermarket workers, cleaners and bus drivers to be the first cabs off the rank for fair pay agreements. We're taking a balanced approach, and we'll make sure that in the design of fair pay agreements that they're negotiated between employers and unions within sectors, and that there will be no industrial action applying. Businesses will work with unions in fair pay agreement negotiations to set minimum terms and conditions for employees across an entire sector or occupational group. You can think of it as being a bit like the minimum wage, that is a condition that below which a worker's terms and conditions cannot fall. There will need to be flexibility within the system, with the possibility of exemptions and regional variations to meet the needs of specific sectors. Importantly, fair pay agreements will help good employers by stopping the race to the bottom. I think that many of us are concerned by what we've seen in industries like the industry that employs bus drivers, where competitive tendering processes have meant that to get contracts, companies have had to effectively lower the pay and conditions for hard-working bus drivers. That's not a sustainable way forward for that sector, and it's not what any of us would want to see for those workers. Fair pay agreements are about stopping that by ensuring that across those industries that we're not giving an advantage to those who would underpay those who would pay low wages. Instead, we want to encourage and support firms to compete on better goods and services, innovation, research and development, and better productivity. We're committed to helping both businesses and unions through the process. It is our intention to provide support for both Business New Zealand and the Council of Trade Unions to help them coordinate fair pay agreements, as well as a training and potentially providing a support person and direct financial assistance for parties who are bargaining for fair pay agreements. We want to build up the capacity of those who participate in the system so that we have good quality, constructive dialogue. When it comes to the process, the fair pay agreement process that I'm announcing today is broadly in line with the recommendations of the Fair Pay Agreement Working Group recommendations that were brought together by the Right Honourable Sir Jim Bolger in 2019. The recommendations in that process were worked through with unions and employers and were very well thought through. They fundamentally address the problem that over 30 years in New Zealand we have seen many workers receiving a lesser and lesser share of the value that they produce, and we have seen sectors falling behind, contributing to significant inequality that none of us as New Zealanders feel comfortable with. As Sir Jim Bolger said in the working group's report, we needed to develop a unique New Zealand-based system but also to look internationally to see systems that work well and deliver better outcomes. The OECD tells us that the best kind of employment relations systems in countries are where there is a mix of individual, enterprise collective level bargaining and sector level bargaining. That happens in places like Australia, where a large number of workers are covered by agreements similar to those that we will be establishing through fair pay agreements. Our decisions were also informed by public consultation, and we've ensured robust involvement with both businesses, unions and civil society. Under the Fair Pay Agreement framework, any union will be able to initiate for a fair pay agreement process as long as they can demonstrate support from 10% of a workforce or 1,000 employees in the proposed industry or occupation. A fair pay agreement will also be able to be initiated via a public interest test in an industry or occupation where employment issues exist, such as low pay or limited bargaining power. It is important to note that fair pay agreements will not replace the need for each worker to have an individual or collective employment agreement. Those agreements will simply need to match or be better than the terms in the fair pay agreement. Again, fair pay agreements will form a minimum set of terms and conditions below which they cannot fall in that sector. Contractors are not currently included in the system. Policy work is beginning soon to address this, and contractors will be included in a future amendment to the Act. As an interim measure, we will be introducing a penalty for misclassifying an employee as a contractor to avoid the provisions of a fair pay agreement. Broadly, any fair pay agreement will need to agree on minimum terms such as wages and working hours, but will allow flexibility to address other relevant topics such as skills and training, health and safety, and flexible working conditions. The fair pay agreement system has been designed to encourage a bargained outcome that fits the needs of a particular sector. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. There will be significant opportunities for collaboration on issues like workforce planning. This is very significant across a range of sectors we see, where the race to the bottom in terms of conditions has led to workforce crises. We've seen that with bus drivers and many others. And I hope that fair pay agreements can be a great platform for employees, unions and employers to work together on long-term issues like health and safety, training and workforce planning. We'll be supporting the process, and mediation services will be provided if terms and conditions cannot be agreed, and the Employment Relations Authority will ultimately be able to issue a determination if the parties cannot reach an agreement or cannot ratify an agreement after 2 attempts. We want to make sure that fair pay agreements are settled and provide certainty for employers and employees, and these provisions will ensure that we don't have protracted and disruptive bargaining processes. In terms of the next steps, I'll be taking some time now to work with officials to draft the legislation, but I intend to introduce the bill in November of this year and expect it to pass by before the middle of next year. We'll continue to work with unions, employers and civil society as we draft the legislation, and there will be a full select committee process once the legislation goes through the House. Everyone will have the opportunity to have their say at that point. Fair pay agreements will be the most significant change to our employment relations system since the early 1990s. That was a point at which employment relations were significantly individualised across the New Zealand workplace relations environment. That has not led to good outcomes. It has led to poorer outcomes for vulnerable workers, entrenched poverty in many sectors, and actually it hasn't supported New Zealand's productivity or economic well-being either. Countries like Australia that took a more balanced approach have had fairer outcomes for workers and stronger productivity than New Zealand has had under its individualised system of employment relations. So I'm confident that with this unique New Zealand approach of fair pay agreements, we will deal with those issues and build an enduring employment relations system that better supports our vulnerable workers, that ensures that those workers who got us through COVID-19 are treated fairly, and sets up a system in which good employers are supported in our country and our economy.
It's our honour and pleasure to welcome you, Minister, for this landmark announcement. Likewise, we would welcome fair pay agreements and a commitment of increased investment by this government. We take great pride in the positive relationships we have with our unions and New Zealand Health Group's operating entities, Geneva and Healthcare New Zealand, will, I assure you, be on the front foot in leading the way to negotiate a fair pay agreement for the home and community health sector. As always, we are ready to work with the unions and the ministry on fairly compensating our staff who do the really tough work in our industry. Our population in Aotearoa has increased significantly. So too has it aged. Our services are needed now more than ever, and that need is only going to increase from here on. These realities, combined with the addressing the COVID pandemic, have shown us that cooperation across the sector is crucial to finding, training and keeping the committed home and community support workers and services needed to address long-standing inequities in health outcomes, especially for our Maori and Pacifica communities. Under the previous government, the pay equity legislation was introduced and welcomed by employers. It was an important shot in the arm and it boosted morale. However, it has never been adequately funded, to the point where many of our DHB contracts have now become unsustainable. We think a fair pay agreement will work well with the implementation of the recently announced Health New Zealand and Maori Health Authority centralised contracting model, providing realistic, sustainable funding for a sector that is truly essential to our society and economy. We must be able to provide staff with good jobs, good conditions and good training along with regular hours of work. This can only be done by having consistent standards across the industry and, if I may be so bold, consistent sustainable funding to make sure these essential workers are fairly remunerated. It will take all three parties working in good faith, the providers, the unions and the government, to make a fair pay agreement a reality at last. However, it fills us with a renewed optimism to hear both Minister Little's ambitions for collaboration in service development and greater health equity, and now today this announcement of increased investment in home and community support services. As the head of the largest overall provider of health and community services, I really look forward to working with the Ministry, other providers and the unions on setting up the first fair pay agreement for the sector and for the country, and being able to implement this positive commitment for our workforce. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Melissa Ansell Bridges toku ingoa, ko New Zealand Council of Trade Unions Tuku Wai Kaimahi Te Mahi. I'm Melissa Ansell Bridges and I'm the Secretary of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. I'm also really pleased to be here today on behalf of working people who are absolutely thrilled that the government has listened to their call to make work fairer in New Zealand and are taking this step forward to making fair pay agreements a reality in New Zealand, because they have the potential to really make a huge difference for the lives of working people in New Zealand. Lots of people in New Zealand, despite being in paid work, live close to the poverty line, and lifting incomes is a way that we're able to make their lives better for them and also for their families as well. In the last year, we have seen how important the work of essential workers is to keeping us safe and healthy and keeping our society functioning. It's the bus drivers and it's the security guards and the cleaners and home support workers, for example, who have kept us well and healthy throughout the COVID crisis. But a lot of working people in those industries earn the minimum wage or close to it. Fair pay agreements will give hope to some of our lowest paid workers, and so we welcome them. The fact that we are a step closer to seeing these better rights in New Zealand is a testament to the very long and hard work of campaigners, of working people who have been asking for these measures to make work fairer in New Zealand for a long time. they've shared their stories, they've talked of how much they care about their work, but how difficult it can be to support their families and to make ends meet. And so I want to thank all of those working people for sharing those stories. It can be quite difficult sometimes, and it takes a lot of bravery and courage, but doing so is why we are here today. I'd also like to thank New Zealand Health Group for showing their support, for hosting us here today. It's really encouraging hearing from employers who care about making sure there are good jobs for workers in New Zealand. And I'd also really like to acknowledge the leadership of the Minister as well in making sure that the work that needed to be done to get us here today was done. And we're really pleased with this announcement today. Look forward to continuing to support the work as legislation is drafted and moves through the House, and also looking forward to our role in ensuring that fair pay agreements become a reality for working people in New Zealand after that. Thank you very much, Minister.